Hi, Gadi. Great to have you with us.
Hi, Tom. Great to be here.
So the first question that I have for you is why Loops? Why did you decide to invest in Loops?
Yeah, so when we spoke, two things impressed me in the approach that overall you have to thinking about data, thinking about product, thinking about decision, and one was really the rigor of the approach overall, and the second one was the methodology. So what I mean by that is that I speak with many firms, and one of the main things that I see is firms are on one side really eager to experiment, but by virtue of being eager to experiment, they make two mistakes. One is that they don't always have the infrastructure to do that. And what I really liked about Loops is the infrastructure you build and really help firms experiment in a more methodical way. But really, even more so, I see many of them, once they experiment, they're so eager to experiment, they experiment on many things at the same time, in which case they really don't have data. They have many things that are confounding each other at the same time. So your approach to causality as someone that is being on one side in academia, but also working with firms, the depth by which you try to help firms really identify the connection between what they did and actually the impact on engagement, growth, monetization, whatever it is, was something that impressed me. And the combination between these two brought me to invest in Loops.
Yeah, you mentioned experimentation, which is actually something that we deal with a lot. And you've seen, I guess, by now, I don't know, thousands, millions of experimentations. And I think throughout the years, you had the chance to teach so many product managers. So I think the question to you, and maybe you want to elaborate on the point that you mentioned earlier, what is the biggest kind of misconception that you see among kind of growth and product teams when it comes to experimentation?
Yeah, probably there are two, but one is that just having more data is better. And that leads me to the second misconception, which is that we all like to say, but I don't think we really understand, which is this notion of correlation is not causation. Just to explain what I mean by that, I see many times firms, let's say launch a new product or launch a new feature of the product or launch a new SKU, for example, and they want to see the impact of that. Now they launch it, the customers that are indeed using this feature are ultimately better engaged. And now their main argument is, okay, let's now launch another feature, for example. And because we have an indication that that feature is generating better engagement. But if you really didn't plan and you didn't have a group that you can actually use as control, or didn't think about how you build it into a overall experimentation strategy, what you might actually look at is something where a subset of customers actually really like that feature or really like that SKU. And the fact that they use that really tells you very little about whether this SKU or what strategy can actually have an appeal beyond that. So the misconception is that we can just behave and do things and let people make decisions in a very decentralized way. And then in retrospect, we can actually look at the data and try to decipher from the data what is the best strategy. This just doesn't work. What it creates a lot of trash. You have a lot of information about many things, many experiments that happen at the same time. Many of them were run for too little of a time, which is another issue because firms are so eager to experiment and so eager to push decision-making to the extremes. And just to be clear, this is clearly so much better than firms that do not experiment. But what I'm trying to say here is that if you are too eager many times and try to push decision-making too much to the decentralized node, so to speak, what you're getting is just a lot of trash. And when I say trash, I mean a lot of information that cannot be used to actually make strategic decisions. And as a firm, if you cannot really be in a situation where you experiment, you make a decision, you get the data, you analyze the data, and make a quick decision again, and make this loop in a we call the firms loops. I mean, it's a very apt name. If you cannot close this loop quickly, it means that you are now continuously chasing other firms. You're continuously chasing your customers. You're continuously chasing events that are happening rather than being the one driving decisions. So the misconception is more is better, which is definitely not the case if you don't do it in a pre-mediated way.
Yeah. No, I 100% agree. I think one of the things that you mentioned and one of the examples that you gave Gary, is this classic selection bias that we see across companies when they launch without A/B tests, and then they kind of look at the pre-post, before, after analysis, and they see some, a segment of users that use them. Okay, but that it doesn't mean that like your KPI retention or conversion or I don't know average revenue per user went up. It's just because those users are like your power users. That's the reason why they use it, and that's the reason why they retain, and not because of this feature that actually cause them to see uplift in the KPI. So I think you mentioned one of the things that we see across many companies these days when they launch something and kind of get to the wrong conclusion at the end of the day.
Exactly. Now, the interesting thing about that is that it's actually, even though conceptually all of us understand it, once firms see the data, it's very hard for them to disregard it. And what I mean by that is that I say, but notice, but we do have an uptick in engagement. But you cannot learn from that anything. And that's really the difficulty here. And that's the thing where I think Loops does a pretty good job in really outlining, showing graphically what are the main things, what are the main opportunities, what are the main lifts, trying to really drill down to causality. No, I don't want to over compliment you, but that's really, I think, where one of the problems they're trying to solve, and I think you do it well.
Yeah, on the spot. Eventually, Gadi, we deal with converting, let's say, insights into actions, hypotheses into action, and so on. As part of this process, you need to create the best collaboration between the product and the growth teams and the data teams. And I think from your experience or what you're seeing across companies, what is do you have a tip for better collaboration and alignment between those teams? Because I think this is kind of perhaps key for this better loop that you just kind of described earlier.
Yeah, I think to me at least, the main understanding should be that data that was collected for the purpose of making decisions is going to be a better data that's going to drive better decisions. So what I mean by that is if we talk about two different groups now, the product people and the data people, the product people are going to make their own decisions and they're going to create this data. Now, because the data was not created for the purpose of making decisions, the analyst will have to use all the most sophisticated econometric tools to try to undo a lot of the damage that was done because this data was not created with the idea of analyzing it later on. The recommendation they're going to give to the product people are going to be a lower quality recommendations. Why? Because the level of confidence they have in making these inferences is going to be lower. Now imagine a world where both are collaborating. Every experiment is conducted with the notion that it's going to be analyzed. The analysis is informed by the way this test was actually conducted. And immediately you can actually come back with very high level of confidence. And by the way, the level of confidence can be, it's great, it worked, let's continue and do it deeper, or let's try to drive deeper what's really causing that. Or it can be, we know by now, we've already launched it or we experimented for long enough to know it has no impact, let's move on. But the point here is that data collected with the idea of being analyzed is when it's embedded in the product, result in a much, much faster loop and in much, much higher confidence on the statistical level, right? One of the danger zone to some extent is one where you have some a confidence in the data, but it's really not deep enough, in which case you have to wait longer to get more confidence or longer to disprove that something is right. And so overall slowing down this entire interaction. So the ability to collaborate between the two usually results in a much, much tighter set of inferences that you can actually make and faster ones.
Yeah. One of the things that I like asking teams when they run an analysis or an experiment is, okay, let's imagine that we have the results now. What action would we take based on different kind of first, let's understand can we take it and what we will learn from those things. And I think some of those best practices companies don't always follow. Let's try to identify what type of actions, what type of business actions we will take even before running the experiment. Even before running this analysis. And I think from that perspective, it's a great tip. The last question that I have there for you, Gadi, is around, we are eventually dealing with looking at the data, coming up with hypotheses, taking action, and hopefully seeing positive results. And I'm sure you've done it once or twice. Can you talk about one example, where you leveraged the data to basically to have drive positive impact on the outcome that you were looking to drive?
Yeah. So let me actually give you an example from education, which is really my world. So let's look at it. When you look at the data, I taught an online class, one of the first online classes at the time at my university. A massive open online course was taught on Coursera. If you look at the data, you see that people that spend more time on discussion boards are more likely to finish the course, to complete these courses. These courses have abysmal completion level. Now, the main issue, going back to selection bias, maybe really there is no causality here. Maybe the reason that people that spend more time on discussion boards are more likely to complete the course is because of some other confounding factors. For example, interest in the course drive you to spend more time in discussions, which actually drive, but also interest drive completion. So if we take all the students and just force them to be in discussion boards, we're not going to see a massive improvement.
Yeah.
So what do? We, at the end of week 1, we send an email anyway to all the students, but we added a nudge randomly to a group of students. What do I mean a nudge? To a small group of students, well, half the students, we added another sentence that said, have you spent time on the discussion board this week? So view that as private shaming. I'm shaming you into the fact that you have not been on the discussion board. And what we did now, we tracked this group of students for the rest of the course. And because it was random, now we can actually attribute everything for that email, right? We'll see a lot of leakage. So there is a lot of econometric work to make sure that those who did not get the email and get to the discussion board, those who got the email and didn't go to the discussion board. So there's some econometric work to do there. But the reality is that at the end of the course, we noticed that for the next 5 weeks, we saw an increase of 30% in course completion for those who actually attended the discussion board. And so the point here is that you start from correlation. You know that this sounds like a great strategy. Let's try to test it. However, to test it, you absolutely have to integrate with the product, launch it as a randomized control trial, look at the data, look at all the comparison, and then make the inference, which then since then, became our strategy, which is to encourage students to be engaged more, encourage them to be involved. The mechanism behind that, then you can actually go and delve deeper into what's the mechanism, but at the very least, you have a clear experiment and a clean experiment to try to understand what's the causal aspect of the drive, stuff like better completion, and engagement is one of them. I hope it helped a little bit understanding. And
as you talked about the education word, but I think it's very much applicable to the product world. Actually, you saw something on the correlation side, you kind of suspect that it's like also driving causation, and you play with some kind of a treatment. By the way, with let's say with emails and some kind of user communication, which is very relevant for let's say onboarding selection activation case for like a B2B SaaS, and then you were able to prove the causation based on that. So even though it's kind of in a different industry, I think a very relevant, very similar to the things that we are seeing, and a very structured process with a very clear hypothesis, talking about our previous point, that you're able to prove, and based on different results what you're going to do with that. So I think it's a great kind of like example of the things that we mentioned actually at the beginning of our call.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gadi. Thank you for your time.
No, thank you, Tom. Thanks. Great.